Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. We have a lot of things to cover, so I'm gonna focus just a little bit on the map and then we're gonna go into the other direction. Around the southern axis, most of the constant directions that we know of, they're mostly tactical approaches right now are happening by Ukrainian armed forces. Fighting is still ongoing. We're hearing some tactical successes in all kind of three areas where Ukraine is advancing, but I'm going to cover in details probably at the end of the week. Additionally, we hear that Russians were trying to counterattack around Krasnohorivka area, which is right here, and it didn't really pan out that great. Around Avdiivka, again, the reports are that Russians are attacking, but nothing that is significantly changing the direction. Ukrainians have reported during the start of this week that they had some success around Kurdyumivka and additional success around Andriivka and Klishivka area, so they're advancing there as well. There is also today reports that there are heavy fighting, but with successful advances of Ukrainians around Berhivka. But the most important part is all of these are tactical level advantage. I recommend you following channels such as Reporting from Ukraine, which covers, these moves and tactical actions in details. But none of these are right now critical. They are not close to any kind of critical targets that will, significantly improve the position. So nothing right now to report. What is significant for me to tell is that there has been news that Russia has accumulated 100,000 armed forces on this Luhansk area at the north, and there was like 900 tanks, and there was like 600 artillery pieces, and so on. And people got really, really crazy about it because, let's get it honestly, those are crazy numbers. Like 100,000 troops of 900 tanks. Wow, that sounds incredible. So let's break it down. Firstly, we need to understand how wide is the front line and what's the breakdown on the forces. Roughly speaking, for the most important thing kind of to say is that these forces, they are not that they just appeared there from nowhere. The forces have been there all this time. Everyone knew that the forces are there. No one, they just didn't spawn, randomly generate from nowhere. They have been there. I have talked about this in previous episodes and so on. So this is nothing new. This was all known. But roughly speaking, there are two kind of accumulations of forces. One around Kremina area, and then another one towards the Kupiansk. That's kind of the two big groupings. This front line is roughly just over 100 kilometers long. So it's quite a long front line. So if we break that down, that's about 1,000 men per kilometer. So one person per meter, roughly a chain of people. That's how much people we're talking about. Obviously, it's not distributed, their accumulation. But the first thing that we need to know is that it was said by Cherevati, which is the Ukrainian administration, Ukrainian staff member, like a military. So on one side, we should believe these numbers because they are the intelligence, they know. However, on the other side, a lot of verified analysts that I have been following, they are calling a little bit of a bullshit on these numbers because it's a little bit unclear whether or not he means that it's 100,000 battle-ready troops, like all of the soldiers that are ready to fight, or this is with all the reserves, all the staff, all the support personnel, so it's like if this is also like the people that are just driving trucks and so on and so on. Because that seems to be the case what he means when he says there is 100,000. Because overall, Russian grouping in Ukraine right now is about 350 to 400,000 people. But that's like essentially everyone. That's not the fighting force. So we need to be aware that if he says 100,000, potentially what he meant is just a general accumulation. A fighting force is usually about 30 to 40% of the supplies, sometimes more, sometimes less. So it's about 30 to 40,000 fighting force if it's the case. But let's take even 100,000. Let's take the worst case scenario, maybe that he was right. If he was right that there's two groupings, larger one being around Kremina, and then the smaller one around Troitsky. Let's say this is 40,000, this is like 60,000. Well, it's not going to be 40, 60,000 because we know something is going to be in the middle. So let's take additional 5,000 off of each one of those. So it's going to be like 55, and this is going to be 35. Is it a lot? Well, let's talk about, for example, 35. 35 was what essentially Wagner stormed Bakhmut with. Did they advance a lot? Not too much. Again, Bakhmut was a defensive position, but it was also like a city, and it was hard to defend. It was easier to defend. However, Ukraine has built fortifications in this area. So if we say like a number of 35,000, that is significant, but it's not like it's a overwhelming number. Like it's not that it's 35,000 just going to attack. It's going to be like on a rotational basis and so on. So is it significant forces? Yes. But is it forces that's going to be guaranteeing a breakthrough, that forces that are allowing 10 to 1 advantage on a specific front line? No, definitely not. 55. Again, is it a lot? Yes. But this is a position that we know there was concentration. There was also concentration of Ukrainian troops in this area. So again, this 55,000, they are not appearing from nowhere. Again, is it enough force for Russia to advance? Yes. But is it enough to conduct any major breakthrough? No. So important thing for us to take away with this number showing that I wanted to say is that it's a concentration of forces that has been set on the north, but it's a forces that's been there. It's a forces then that while large, it doesn't guarantee a huge breakthrough. This is especially important because we have received notice that they have intensified attacks both towards the Kupiansk direction and towards Liman direction. And it's been like already 4 days since. Since then, we've seen only marginal gains in the north and only marginal gains in the south. Now, obviously, it's heavy fighting. Like, there's some videos on my Discord server, join the Discord, and there are heavy fightings. Nothing comes easy in this war. Whenever I'm saying something, it's never easy. It's actual bloody fighting. But the point is, it's just a spoiler attack. And this is where some of the people in the comments, they did a thing. They started saying that Ukraine should send more troops to stop this advantage. And for me, it didn't make sense because that's exactly what they want. Because this attack that Russians are doing on this northern side, it's a spoiler attack. They want to create pressure on Ukraine. So Ukraine is forced to then remove certain number of their reserves to send to this northern front line to spoiler their attack in the south, so they don't have reserves. And this is where I need to explain very simple thing. Why reserves are important. One thing that I've learned, and I'm a commoner, right? With one thing I learned about war and warfare is that everything is a resource in war. Everything is a total resource. So, and let's take some kind of simple case. So let's take, we have Army A, which is, let's say that they have 100%, some kind of 100% bar. And then let's take Army B, that also is 100%. So if these armies with equal resource, let's, very simple, like, for example, fight each other, then they halve each other. So at the end, there's going to be 50, and there's going to be 50 left percent. For example, they fight each other, no one advances, no one gains territory, so stuff happens. However, if we say that, for example, Army A has 100%, but then Army B has, for example, 200% of troops or resources, let's just say resources. At that moment, when the fighting happens, then, for example, Army B will lose only 25% of their troops. So they will be left with 75% of troops. Whereas Army A, for example, will be left with, 35% of the troops. And then Also, Army B will be able to take some ground. Now, let's take this to kind of next level. Let's say Army A has the same 100% of the troops. And then Army B will have, for example, 500% of the troops. Now, at this moment, Army B will lose, for example, 10% of their troops, so leaving 90% of their troops alive, whereas Army A will lose about 90% of their troops and leaving only 10%. And Army B will be able to advance significantly. So what does this mean? What is this ratio? And again, it's all made up numbers. What matters here is just the tendency. And the tendency here is very simple. The more resource you have, the harder you win. The more resources you have concentrated on a very specific area, the harder you win. So you gain more territory, you inflict more damage, you lose less resources yourself, you lose less power. So resources, to put it mildly, are utilized better when there is a lot of them. So a concentration of resources really helps with both preserving resources long term and winning harder over your enemy. Therefore, when people say, "Oh, there is like some army that is attacking Ukraine on this side," Ukraine should then balance it out and try to send some reinforcements to help on the worsening side. That is, on one side, is true because you're helping your brothers fight defensively. But what you're doing is you're preventing a harder winning on the south. So you are using resources inefficiently. And in warfare, inefficient use of resources, that means more people die. Another, because Ukraine is using some other resource that it has. It can use time and it can use land. So you can, instead of sending, for example, people here to help defend, Ukraine can trade some of the land to Russians while preserving their resource for the attack to win over harder. So in a nutshell, while maybe not dedicating resource to the support against the Russian offensive and trading away some land resource, Ukraine can preserve human resources and use them to preserve even more resources to win harder against Russians in the offensive. So that's kind of the thing that I understood over the year, and I hope this kind of explains you why spreading out your power is a really bad idea, because war is like a competition in an unfair fighting. We in the West, we are brought up with this idea that a fair fight is what we must do. It's like that's what's noble, that's what is really knightlyhood or knightly or something like that. Warfare is literally the competition of unfairness. The more unfair you make the fight for your enemy, the better. So that's kind of the point. Then let's talk about Crimea and Crimean Bridge. So in here, we everyone know what happened by this point. So Ukraine used some surface drones. Someone says most probably from Snake Island, because that's like the closest kind of land border they have. And they use these drones to get to the Kerch Bridge. First and foremost, that is not an easy operation. Someone was instantly saying, "Oh, why didn't they do it before? Why didn't they do it after? Why didn't do it every night?" This is not a simple operation. This is over 400 kilometers that these drones needed to go in the sea undetected. That is not an easy task. Russia is very active. So the fact that Ukraine was able to do it was a big, big success. So excuse me that maybe not all of the bridges was destroyed. It is still a huge success. Right now, Russia has restored some operations of the bridge, allowing essentially what happened is there is like a car bridge that consists of two sides. One side collapsed completely, whereas the other one went kind of sideways. So what Russians did, they looked at this sideways side and it's like, well, it's still kind of holding. Let's just put some asphalt on it, kind of put it as a road, And it's like, if you look at the pictures, it's like 1 meter apart, and they just put some asphalt on top of it. To say that it's not safe is an understatement of the century. And finally, let's talk about the grain deal. So Russia has exited grain deal, and they instantly, as soon as they were out, they started striking grain in Odessa. And I mean, I already talked about it. It's the same when I was talking about grain deal before. Russia is a terrorist state because Russia is doing exactly what terrorists are doing. They're taking hostages, the population that don't have access to cheap food. They are trying to blackmail to get some resources for themselves, to get this as a win for themselves. They are throwing a temper tantrum, and this is just for the world another check whether they will swallow Russian aggression. This is for NATO, whether they want to talk with terrorists, because the answer to talk with terrorists is no, you should not talk with terrorists. But I think this is a huge a huge loss generally for developing countries and United Nations and everything, because while because in United Nations, after Crimean Bridge was struck, it was the head of the United Nations, Guterres, that came out and says that Ukraine should not target civilian objects. First and foremost, not a civilian object. Nothing about Crimean Bridge is civilian object. Look it up, any convention, anything. Go ask ChatGPT. Like, a big ass bridge that is primarily used to supply military forces is not a civilian object. Civilians using that object, but it's not a civilian object. So he was lying right there. But more importantly, Russia strikes Ukrainian cities and civilian centers every night, and we don't see this UN clown coming out ever again to talk about how bad Russia is doing. Obviously, he's a sellout motherfucker, and I really hate him, and I think UN is a joke under him. But I think it's irrelevant for us. Why? Because the developing nations, like, we don't really win that much from UN at all. Like, for us, it's a discussion platform. It's for the developing nations that UN was an actual, like, way to kind of have some kind of voice in the world. And the fact that a lot of these nations, a lot of these developing nations, like nations in Africa or in Latin America or whatever else, they essentially support Russia in a large sense, like, because they perceive this ambiguity in this imperial conflict that Russia is waging. When a UN member is abusing their power, instead of stepping up to that UN member and making pressure to Gutierrez, to every organization, saying no, there is an international law that we need to abide for, the country said no, we have our certain personal relationship with Russia. Russia is financing our certain products and so on. The truth is, we European nations, US, everything else, we will get through. We're rich enough. That's the truth. We're privileged. World is not fair. That's true. Like, we know that world is not fair. So, and the point is, the main losers from the reduction of the rule of law, in a sense of marginalizing the role that UN plays, is actually the nations that are right now cannot come out and clearly state and say that Russia is a terrorist state, that Russia is waging this imperial war. That because right now the same African nations that were trying to do a little bit of a lap dance for Putin, right now Russia is sending missiles to destroy the same grain that would fit their own people. So that's why, while I'm mad at the United Nations that there is no world order, I, as a white dude, am privileged enough to be a European citizen to also understand that it is not my government that is shooting myself in the foot. I'm sorry if this is hurtful, but it's the governments of a lot of these nations that are not calling Russia by what they are, a terrorist state that is waging an imperial colonial warfare right now on a country that did nothing to them. And by not calling a spade, they are literally putting themselves in danger in a medium to long run. Thank you so much for watching this, guys. I love you all. Slava Ukraini. Thank you so much to moderators. And I'll see you guys next time.